Right, thank you, everybody. It's very nice of so many people to turn out on a genuinely beautiful afternoon in February. This is the second intervention, the second speech, the second paper given in a series I've been running since 2020 called The History of the Present. And in the course of the last 5 years, I've invited a great many people, including some of the best known scholars in Europe, actually, in this particular field, to talk about very much topics that unite the past and the present. That's the basic idea of the seminar series. Well, I'm extremely pleased that our speaker today is Hansen of Linköping University in Sweden, who is certainly well qualified to do this combination of past and present. Apart from the fact he went to college on a tennis scholarship. It's a rare case of a genuine jock who made it to become a professor. And he works on migration policy, where he's in fact quite a leading critic of the EU's policy. I think I'm fair enough to say, but has also consulted for the OECD. Various things that anybody who's interested in migration might like to look at his book of Modern Migration Theory, an Alternative Approach to Failed EU Policy. But I know it precisely because of our shared work on European integration history, and I think it's fair to say he is in the revisionist camp on this particular topic, as am I. And in particular, he wrote a book in 2013, was it published? 2014, called Eurafrica, The Untold History of European Integration and Colonialism, which, at the risk of making him blush, I think I can say is a landmark in recent scholarship in European integration history. It's certainly one of the best known books of the last 20 years. Co-authored, of course. In fact, yes, I shouldn't forget, with his colleague and friend Stefan Johnson. He's been a senior fellow at the Remark Institute in New York, and is currently, for the second time, Simon Weil Fellow at the European University Institute. His paper today marks a departure, I think, into the geopolitical turn of the EU and the whole question of self-determination. I've not heard it myself yet. I'm looking forward to do it, not least because I've been thinking about the same topic myself recently. And so, Ben, hello, yours.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, a big thanks to you, Mark, and to John Hopkins for inviting me. Should I turn this on?
Yeah.
Like that? You can hear me well? Yeah. So thanks a lot. It's a great honor to be here and a great opportunity, because this is some of this stuff here, or quite a lot of it is very new. Some of it I'm not super well read on. Some of it I've hardly begun reading. Some of it, obviously, I'm much more familiar with, but it's, as you see, 100 years on, which is really, ludicrous to try to do. But I think it's a better one, because another title I've had is Europe's long 20th century. And the first time I talked about that, I was given 5 minutes. And I felt that was, soothing. So, small nations, Europe's great enemy, geopolitics of European unity, and the problem of self-determination 100 years on. I will do this in a very impressionistic way, using a lot of slides with quotes to illustrate my point. And one of them is that this is a history of a thing that shouldn't really exist, because the obituary has been written about the small state. If you go all the way down to the 19th century, they are many, and they're still being written today. So I saw there were bees in the advertising for me, but I think of the small state as a bumblebee. Can you see it? Almost not possible. But as I said, it's not supposed to fly. It's not supposed to exist. In the early 20th century, there was widespread consensus, both within academic circles and in political circles, that the small state was going to die fairly soon, and it would not spring up again. And interestingly, that's been the story ever since the formalization of the small state after the Napoleonic Wars. So after the 1815 and the concert of Europe and the Holy Alliance and all that, there was this sort of formalization of great powers and small powers that continued. And of course, in 1919, it was formalized in a new way, in a legal way, that hadn't been seen before. And then after 45, it happened again with the beginning of decolonization. And you can say 89, 91, it's another period of the proliferation and final sort of ending with the system we have today, where we have a system of so-called nation states that was a system that was not supposed to become. And I explained that to you. But let me begin by saying, what do I mean with a small state? Because it's not straightforward. So this is the famous Leviathan cover of Thomas Hobbes' book. I'm a political scientist, and I was taught that this was the book about nation-state sovereignty. And rereading it a few years ago, I realized that it was not at all about that. Of course, since back in 1651, there was no such nation-state system around. So it's a typical political science thing to do, reading it from the current vantage point. But the interesting thing here to look at, and I illustrate that by showing Yorgo Agamben's take on this picture, because it's saying what is decisive is the surprising fact that the mortal God, the artificial man called Commonwealth or state, does not dwell within the city, but outside it. His place is exterior, not only with respect to the walls of the city, but also with respect to its territory, in a no man's land or in the sea. It's my underlinings. In any case, not within the city. The Commonwealth, the body political, does not coincide with the physical body of the city. Is this surprising? When I read Hobbes again, I realized that no, it should not be surprising, because Hobbes wrote not about that little thing. He didn't write about this. He wrote about this. And so why? He did not speak about the nation state. What he defined, and for him, sovereignty belonged to things like that, to the empire. And there, it's no surprise that it's straddling, or even not even being in Britain. So this is what sovereignty is in Hobbes. It's built on the Roman Empire. So it's sovereignty for the empire, not that which we today refer to as the nation state, or a small state, or a small nation. So that is very important. So Hobbes writes, the Athenians and Romans were free, that is, free commonwealths. Their representative had the liberty to resist or to invade other people. They didn't have both of these, they weren't truly sovereign. And we have this confusion with us throughout, and today too. So this is Max Weber confusing again, saying we hesitate to call them nations, not because of their relative smallness. The Dutch appear to us as a nation, but because these neutralized states have purposely forsaken power. So what he should have said, it's referring to the Dutch is, of course, it's a small one, but was at the time one of the greatest empires in the world. So what he's really talking about here is the empire, not what he thinks of as so when he says he hesitates to call them nations, these are small states, small nations, precisely because they have forsaken power. So that is the definition of a small state. But we have it sort of wrong all the time, and that's why we call empires for nation states, when in fact they should be called empires. And then we have the great powers and then small powers. So again, the small nation or the small state, that's without this. It's simply
If you get too near the screen.
oh really? That's a touch. So it's without that, it's simply that. Small ones, they are on their own. They don't have the luxury of having that which protects them from outside, but also builds, expands the empire on the outside. So the small state, small nation, I remember I said 1815. It's just one quote from that period, which is very illustrative. To have brought all the small powers into the alliance, and now we're talking about small powers inside Europe, would clearly have been to make the machine unworkable. Remember that the machine cannot work with the small ones participating, because then it's not a machine, then it's just chaos or weakness. And we can go to Friedrich Naumann 100 years later, who also wrote the obituary for the small state, saying, all the allies in the Great War feel without argument that neither now nor in the future can small or even moderate-sized powers play any large part in the world. Sovereignty, that is freedom to make decisions of wide historical importance, very synonymous with Hobbes' definition of sovereignty. It's now concentrated at a very few places on the globe. The spirit of large-scale industry and of supranational organization has seized politics. People think, again, Cecil Rhodes once expressed it, incontinence. So again, this is, and we can go forward.
Yeah, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Is that where Carr gets it from Neumann?
Say?
Is that where E.H. Carr gets it from Neumann, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So this is a commentary that picked up Woodrow Wilson's notes after the 1919 Versailles settlement, and again blaming things on the small, saying nothing but regard for its own interest was to expect it from any small state. Well, what do we expect from great powers? Well, of course, universalism, disinterested, right? So again, easy to make a case why the small ones shouldn't be participating. Jan Smuts, again, who wrote prior to the peace agreement, and he was very engaged as he was in the UN formation. He was very engaged also in the League of Nations. And he asked the question, sounds like a joke, will the United States of America count for as much and the same as Guatemala? But it's not. The question is crucial. And he couldn't work it out. He tried, but it's very, very difficult. So it's a crucial question that stays us with today. So this is just from a couple of weeks ago, Gideon Lachman in Financial Times, referring to, of course, Greenland, Denmark, and the US claim to it. But the rights of small nations are not a joke. Attacks on small countries triggered the First and Second World Wars. The idea of European leaders invoking the EU's mutual defense clause against the US, not Russia, would also have seemed like fantasy. So it's right with us today. And so it's very much the history of the present. And it's, of course, also very contradictory, because the same Gideon Rachman advocated something very different just a few years ago, when he actually advocated empire. So you can't have it both ways. Either you have a world where the small state and the small states' rights are not a joke, or you have just pure power like he's advocating now. And it shows how we still haven't settled the matter. There is still all this animosity against having small states participate. Philip Stevens, his colleague, wrote in 2014, globalization needs an enforcer, a hegemon, a leviathan, a concert of powers. So now we're back to 1815, the concert of Europe, or global governance arrangements sufficient to make sure the rules are fairly applied without a political architecture that locates national interests. And here is, of course, referring to national interests articulated by the small ones. In mutual endeavors, the economic framework is destined to fracture and fragment. And here's Martin Wolf. Some way will also have to be found to form and implement a common foreign and security policy for the EU. It will also be necessary to reduce the ability of recalcitrant members, such as Viktor Orban's Hungary, to block essential common policies. Of course, if it's essential, then only a few interests will matter. So again, the ambivalence of supporting the small ones in some context, but then advocating totally different solutions that go back really to 1815 and forward. And you already mentioned H. Carr, and that's why if you read Carr now,
everybody should.
Yeah, it's an amazing book in that sense, because it is like reading. So much of it is like reading today. And what I mean by that is what Carr he emphasized so strongly, that you know the dangers of having a world order based on laws, rules, and morals, purely based on a few countries' interests, but always articulated as if it's in everybody's interest. And the Financial Times op-ed is a very good place to sort of to look at that and compare the interwar period. So much of it comes from my interest in EU geopolitics. As Mark mentioned about Eurafrica, I found in that research, I found so many ideas of this. And then when the EU declared officially that they have become a geopolitical project, that caught my attention. And so I've studied that a lot recently. And that's also where I get the long 20th century notion from, because it is a very long 20th century in the sense that Europe and organized Europe cannot sort of come to terms with this with the problem of being sort of a power project and a geopolitics. So it's an endless doubling down on really failures and dangerous projects, I would argue, because the simple logic in a geopolitics of European unity is that it's built to project power externally, but that requires internal centralization. It's very simple, and the quotes I've shown have already sort of shown that. Europe must speak with one voice. We hear that all the time. And of course, in this logic, the small states, like they have done through history, they take center stage, but they do it as problems, as nuisance, as something that really sort of complicates. And what is the complicating factor is, of course, self-determination. And I will come back to that. And of course, just to give something about you're all familiar with this, but the notion that we have of a geopolitical European Union is that it's a new thing now. So there's no history of this project, and that's why it becomes articulated in a way that, oh, we used to be a peace project, now we have to, Russia, China, and the US, they force us to become geopolitical, but we haven't been that in the past because we're all about peace and multilateralism and so on. So despite the political innocence of its history, the strategic culture is gradually being established within the European institutions. Well, as we show in Eurafrica, this is strategic culture from the get-go. The EU was this huge geopolitical project in '57 when the Rome Treaty was signed. All the pink area here is the EU sphere of influence. So the pink is what became the associated colonies of mainly France and Belgium. And as you see, also Algeria is was in it, but in a different color, because Algeria was actually formally incorporated territorially into the EU, meaning that 75% of EU territory when it was founded was in Africa. And it was also meaning that it was founded during a very, very bloody war in Algeria that France intentionally wanted to bring into the EU. And there's a very good book on this out just recently by Megan Brown, showing in detail how France played this. So yes, it was very much a geopolitical, geoeconomic project from the start, but that is not, so yeah, that is forgotten and suppressed today. The EU's 50th attempt then was again, it was an attempt to arrest the development of small states in Africa, meaning arrest decolonization from coming to the African continent. And in this, they were very, very adamant to portray the nation state as the big, big enemy. They did not want the world to become this nation state system. And so nationalism, sovereignty, self-determination, they were all seen as threats, but they were also cast as antiquated, as having seen their day, because now it was all about independence, and then the nation state was a relic of the past. So here's an example from France's Foreign Minister Christian Pineau, when he spoke of the so-called right to independence and of the right of peoples to self-determination as a sort of mystic aim of the international organization, meaning the UN here, that would end in multiplying the number of states at a time when, on the contrary, the peoples should be brought together in common action. For Pineau and France, therefore, the best solution would be to enable the nations to become something other than states, and that is Eurafrica, to be associated as colonies with the EU. And this was widely shared then, not only by the EU organization or member states, but all sorts of organizations and other initiatives. So this is just from the Committee for the United States of Europe, talking about continent states, that's the only future. And here's E.H. Carr again. Now he's getting caught in his own sort of trap, because now he's the one who doesn't want to change status quo. So he was adamant that there should not be a world of many states. It should stay within the big power blocks. They should control it. Stanley Hoffman backed him up, but then it was all gone in '66 when saying that the fragmentation of the world into countless units, each of which has a claim to independence, is obviously dangerous for peace and illogical for welfare. So there was a widespread academic consensus long into the post-war period that continued to say that we should not develop the world into a nation-state system. It should stay with big, great powers, empires, and so on. That's how order should be maintained. Raymond Aron is another great figure to study here, because he was also adamant that there be a replacement for the great powers of Europe. That would be the European Union or the European Community, and he referred to that as an autonomous community, meaning that could play that role that the great powers in Europe played before, but couldn't anymore. So autonomy here, strategic autonomy, it's very much related to this, the autonomy to be able to project power without resistance. back again, I will go, as I said, I jump back and forth to different time periods, but here's a really interesting book that I can recommend everybody to read if you haven't already, by Jose Ortega y Gasset, The Revolt of the Masses. It's still, I think, in print. It's a widely read book and translated to many languages. So he was the one picking up in the interwar period, together with so many who were very worried about the decline of Europe. And by Europe, he meant, of course, great powers, three of them. And he was also very anxious about the fact that he knew that these great powers could not alone, even though they still owned these fantastic empires, they still couldn't really project the type of power that they needed. And so he felt that they were institutionally, they were constrained in a way that had to change. And that change was then sort of a geopolitics built on European unity. And so he said Europe's long and splendid past has brought it to a new stage of existence where everything has increased, meaning you have the Soviet Union and most of all you have the United States. But at the same time, the institutions surviving from the past are dwarfed and have become an obstacle to expansion. And now she finds herself obliged to exceed herself. So Europe is obliged to exceed. It's this thinking in terms of continents, Cecil Rhodes, I would annex the stars. It's that we have to become big, but there are institutions preventing us from becoming to realize our potential. And that's, of course, goes straight into today's debate about the institutional constraints in the current European Union. One of the most important constraints being the veto. And that is what many are arguing, and this is Ursula von der Leyen, who says that to be a global leader, the Union needs to take decisions in a faster, more efficient way. Who can be against speed and efficiency? Anyway, we must overcome unanimity constraints that hamper our foreign policy. Again, for over 100 years, same question about the constraints hampering a truly geopolitical European organization. And we have Timothy Garton Ash, of course, in the Foreign Affairs piece that he wrote in summer of 23. Same logic. Paradoxically, he says, to secure this post-imperial future and stand up to Russian aggression, the EU must itself take on some of the characteristics of an empire. It must have a sufficient degree of unity, central authority, and effective decision-making to defend the shared interests and values of Europeans. If every single member state has a veto over vital decisions, the Union will falter internally, externally. So again, it's that same sort of quest of changing institutional constraints or getting rid of them to open up for a geopolitics of European Union. And that's it. Martin Sandberg did the title, Europe still fails to make enough of its size. We hear that all the time too, that there, again, he refers to forms of integration adopted in the 1980s and 90s. They are no longer sufficient. Why? Because they constrain what Europe could become. So it's very much in Ortega y Gasset's framework still. And we could look at Jacques Chirac's infamous statement in 2003, because here it was really testy. The the Bush administration was purposely splitting Europe over the Iraq War. And we still live in the aftermath of that. That is also so obvious. Again, the Eastern enlargement was already taken care of. So risk-free, the newcomers and many others in the old EU, they could defy French and German and other countries' will to contest the US war in Iraq. And again, Chirac, speaking of those who went against him as infantile and dangerous, acted frivolously because entry into the European Union implies a minimum of understanding for the others. They missed a great opportunity to shut up. What a great beginning. I mean, maybe you should have thought about this before you said yes to enlargement. So again, here we have this example of how, and also the dangerous consequences of wanting geopolitics, but then the constraint being that there are different interests and there are different opinions within this European Union. And what happened, of course, with Eastern enlargement is that you built geopolitical conflicts into the European project. And it goes with, Chirac and Walter Lippmann, they're on the same page here. Lippmann is saying that this thing of small countries having an independent foreign policy, that's ridiculous, because that will do what happened in 2003. It will mess with great power interests and also great power conflicts. So it's referring to the good neighbor policy here of the US in Latin America as a better policy. But we also, and this is also important, politically, this is not straightforward. Left, right, liberal could argue all the same thing. And so when Habermas and Derrida, they pleaded for a common foreign policy in 2003, they too sort of went into this logic that I'm displaying here. So they said, for the moment, only the core European nations are ready to endow the EU with certain qualities of a state. So this was an attempt then to build on the protest against the Iraq war, and from there set up Europe as a counter to US unilateralism. If Europe is not to fall apart, only such a step will succeed in generating the momentum that other member states will not be able to resist in the long run. In the framework of the future European Constitution, there can and must be no separatism. So what they're doing is speaking so casually of their own countries as the core. Other member states will not be able to resist in the long run. And this is, of course, logical, since the core assumes the periphery. A core assumes that there is somebody, some countries, some states that are more important than others. And that we're not dealing with equality here, that this is not what they're talking about. They're simply saying that you will not be able to resist. This will go our way. And they describe France and Germany as the locomotive of Europe, that everybody should just sort of they should just hook up to that train and hope for the best. And also saying that there can be no separatism, separatism being a very, very loaded and bad word. You could also say there can and must be no difference of opinion or different interests. But it's better than to couch it in separatism terms. But at the same time, turning around, say, we're not going to exclude you. And so assuming that you will be taken care of if you just sit down and shut up, much like Chirac and so on. And this, again, goes back, if you read the newspapers from the Versailles treaty negotiations, it's all over the place. It's this, like Clemenceau told the small nations yesterday that the big powers had won the war and suffered practically all the losses and sacrifices, that it was for them to make peace and that the small nations should be grateful for being asked to participate in the conflict. So you should be happy for being included, but once included, you're nothing. That's the message. And Wilson, he took the same position as Clemenceau. He said that the great powers were responsible for the peace treaty and for the future peace of the world. So they must also have the right to provide against what might be a grave menace to peace, unless there was some power or control outside the protesting nations. The British military representative at the League of Nations, temporarily, he spoke of the unmitigated nuisance triggered by small nations' opposition. And so he said the most vociferous representatives of the small powers were always nagging and bullying the great powers and telling them to play the game. I have some sympathy with the complaint of Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini against the constitution of the League that confers equality as between, say, Germany and El Salvador. That was a scandal. Of course, at this time, Germany was a great power again, so there was inequality between Germany and El Salvador. But this speaks to the fact too that the Assembly of the League of Nations was really the first talking shop for small nations. And there were not only European small nations, there was Ethiopia and there were Latin American countries who could make their voice heard. And that was a nuisance because they many times did not share the great power interests. And many times they also realized that small countries had more in common. And so European countries, and that was of course a grave danger when they decided to realize common interests with non-European small states. I'll come back to that. So I illustrate this. This is from the cupola of the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa, which was built after the war. It's a liberation site. And in it, there is this mural from the League of Nations when Haile Selassie, who was then in exile because the Italians had now invaded Ethiopia. And Italy was allowed to give a victory speech in the hall, and Haile Selassie was also allowed to say a few words for himself. And he made 2 attempts. I come back to that. In the second attempt, he got to say what he wanted to say. He said that he was defending the cause of small peoples who are threatened with aggression. It is the principle of the equality of states on the one hand, or otherwise the application laid down upon small powers to accept the bonds of vassalship. The thing is, he had to make 2 attempts because the first attempt, he was shouted down by fascist Italian journalists who were standing in a corner and jeering and screaming and shouting. The president of the event did not do much. So Nicolae Titulescu took it upon himself to try to shut down the Italian journalists. And he said, "Mr. President, get these savages out." That became world news because it was seen as totally wrong. And he was, the Mussolini government got so irritated that they forced the Romanian government to fire, to kick out Nicolae Titulescu from his foreign secretary role. This is how bad did this become. But what it shows is this danger of small European countries actually realizing that they had more in common with their peers, and Ethiopia was the only member of the League of Nations from Africa, but that they had maybe more in common with each other than Romania would have with the great powers in Europe. Sweden did the same with Uruguay. They went together to complain about the great powers' attempt to sort of legalize foreign intervention, and I'm sure there's many instances in the same direction. So, as I said, yes, this is what the League of Nations, this is one very interesting aspect of it, that this joining of small countries created cooperation debates that wouldn't have been taken place otherwise. I'm almost done here. How am I on time? Yeah, good. So back to today. Much of the world is not preoccupied with geopolitical contests. That's simple, but very profound. We need to hear it, I think. And then ask the question, so what are those, the many, to do that are not interested in geopolitics? Well, Sullivan has a clear answer, or he was Biden's national security advisor. His answer was simple. For those who are not preoccupied with geopolitics, they should join America. And he said, there cannot be too much America in the world. And I can't help but think of what the Danes think today. If they think that they have too little or much of America. But again, this is crucial, because that's really a dividing line. Most countries are not preoccupied with geopolitics. They are the Hobbes without the Leviathan. They are the small states. And they are often in a very precarious position. What I've left out, and where I want to make more research, is a time period that is sort of, written off, if you're an EU scholarship, as Eurosclerosis or Europessimism, stagnation, 60s and 70s, early 80s. Nothing happened, we're taught. But in reality, this period is a very dynamic period. It's picking up from where the League of Nations left off. So many small states in the world actually started to cooperate. It started in the global south, or the newly liberated countries, the Bandung and later the non-aligned movement, but where a lot of even Western European countries did join. So it was a very dynamic period where, again, the issue of those not preoccupied with geopolitics, how they should navigate during the Cold War. And most striking, I think, is that this is the only period that contradicts my sort of my frame here of saying that there have always been this doubling down on a geopolitics of European unity. But this period is interesting because it is the period when a lot of Europeans became comfortable with not ruling the world and not sensing a defeat, and that there was a decline. But on the contrary, not ruling the world, not being geopolitical, was seen as a grand opportunity for something else. And many countries did participate in that. Even West Germany saw that with Willy Brandt, when he wrote, "We cannot ignore the fact that the interests of the non-major powers are becoming increasingly similar. As new young states are born in Africa and Asia, Europe's relative importance is declining. This would have happened even if two superpowers had not emerged simultaneously." But again, that Europe is not calling the shots everywhere is not seen as a problem, but an opportunity. However, many today take self-determination and sovereignty for the small nation to be a mistake. And I've shown many quotes on that now. And for over 100 years, this mistake has been allowed and to frustrate Europe's potential to external power project, to project power externally the way it used to be able. But at the same time, these 100 years, they're also defined by the failure to put back the self-determination genie in the bottle. And that's very crucial. because that's what we see in 1919. And there's a fantastic book on that by Erez Manela called The Wilsonian Moment, where he shows that self-determination call from Wilson caught the attention of the whole world. So that's why Ho Chi Minh, for instance, participated in Versailles, and representatives from other colonized countries who saw this as an opportunity. There, the genie was put back in a bottle and would then come back after 45. But in Europe, the genie could not be put back in the bottle. But yet, in 1919, as I showed with the Clemenceau and all these quotes, is that they opened up for self-determination, but then they realized, the great powers realized that they had to suppress it, that they'd done a big mistake by saying that you could also have a word at the table. That's why, and given all the obituaries that have been written about the small state, my claim and call is that there's so much to gain from looking at the small nations from and the non-geopolitical character, which I think deserves so much more attention, especially given the climate we have today. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to throw it open to the floor very soon, and I'm sure there's going to be lots and lots of comments. We just heard a democratic approach to international relations theory. I'm going to ask Dana, do you want to ask the first question? Because Dana has to go, so if you wanted to ask the first question.
Thanks. It was fascinating. Really stimulating. Thank you. Great, some great things. But I guess my question, my fairly obvious question, is how far do you want to take this? You know, you spoke about the dangerous logic of external power projection, but you know, part of the logic is internal protection. I mean, particularly at a time when European states, including the small states, including Denmark, for example, are threatened from both Russia and most recently the United States and President Trump. So, you know, that's just an obvious question. To what extent are you arguing for such sovereign equality that we lose the ability to organize and protect? I mean, just a couple thoughts as I was listening to you. Remembering Jacques Chirac, I mean, yeah, he was ill-tempered, rude, wrong in principle. I would argue very correct and right in practice. I mean, you know, the big issue was one on which he was absolutely correct. And if the world had listened to him, we'd be in a better place. I don't think that bringing, you know, Eastern European states into line would have made that much of a difference. But I mean, and then I think of a recent example, which is possibly outside of your framework, but it's an example of smaller states objecting to imperious attitudes of bigger powers who say, we know how to organize this. And that's Obama negotiating the JCPOA. Obama, together with the European Union, with the major European states, and well, obviously also Russia and China. And, you know, there was huge anger in the Gulf among the Arab states who felt that they were ignored. And the American position is we need, you know, we have an overriding interest in non-proliferation and stopping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, and we're going to do this. Bringing too many people into the discussion will prevent us from doing this.
Okay. You just answer that one, and then I'll open to.
Yes, thanks a lot. Very good questions. It is, I think, impossible to resolve in a sort of principle way. And historically, we have seen small states trying to navigate this very precarious terrain when they are threatened by great powers and so on. I mean, I mentioned Denmark. I'm born a Dane, so I can talk. I've been following that country's foreign policy for quite some time. It is hard to find a more willing vassal to the US than Denmark. They were part of not only the occupation of Iraq, but they were also part of the invasion. And this is how they're being paid for the duty. And this is what many small countries think. They think that they will, in the end, be compensated for all the sacrifice they do for great powers. But I think we learn again and again that that's not the case. I mean, Ukraine for a while was the third biggest contingent occupying Iraq. And for sure, I checked comments saying at the time that Ukrainians saying that this gives us protection in the future from Russian aggression. Yes, some protection, but no boots on the ground. The US will not sacrifice for Ukraine, but Ukraine will sacrifice for the US. So that's one sort of lesson, but it's extremely hard to find an answer, because small powers' position are in some sense also built on sheer luck, and then also on like in Ukraine's case, but many other small countries, that they are simply in a position where it's hard to avoid being sort of being in this very difficult position. But I can say that on the geopolitical issue, because when countries are turning to geopolitics, whether big or small, meaning in the case where a small country, like my own country, Sweden now, has become the most hawkish country in Europe, arguably, on the Ukraine issue and against Russia. That sort of attitude, the geopolitical attitude, I find very dangerous in and of itself, because it's an attitude that refuses engagement. And I think engagement has to be there. There has to always be that opening. And again, coming from Sweden, there used to be the primary example, together with a few other countries, of really engaging, of being countries that built diplomatic corps of extremely skillful diplomats who engaged in all kinds of conflicts around the world. That's the thing. If you believe that a geopolitical attitude is the way to go, I think that will always be dangerous. And for a small state, it can be very, very dangerous. So I think the better way is to sort of cultivate that other road, which is engagement, which is sort of saying, we've done geopolitics, we know the consequences. We cannot independently in any way drive geopolitics. We can only be sort of vassals, and that's even more sort of a dangerous position. So let's do something else. And I think that's what I'm looking for in this history, those moments, those openings when countries realize that, yes, we will engage, and we will cooperate with those who are equally willing to engage. Long answer. About Iraq, yes, I mean, I agree with his opinion, of course, that the Iraq War was a very bad idea. But what I'm saying is that his position it doesn't matter what position he would take, it would be his interest that would found that position. And so that's what I think is the most interesting, to look at that and to say, well, if that's your attitude, and then that's my point, then you should have thought about enlargement in the first place, because you knew that enlargement would compromise French geopolitics. And now the time had come, but then the moment was gone, and so that's my point, that you have that attitude from a great power inside the European Union that is saying, just like the 20 years crisis, that this is right because we say it's right. But he could argue other positions where he would do, similar things that comparable to invading countries and so on. But that would be right, because then it was the French interest and so on. But I stop there. Sorry.
Okay, I'm opening up the floor to students first. I'd just like you to just say a few words about yourself, as much as you want. I'm not obliging you to say more than you want. I'm going to take 3 questions. First of all, over there by the window. Second, in the middle here. And then third at the front with Ian with the glasses. Okay.
All right, thank you very much for your talk.
Please be brief and just give a few words about
Yeah, I'm also born a Dane. I still am one. Studying for Master in International Relations, going to DC next year. My name is Simon Kasper. My question is sort of the way the comments you just gave in response to the previous question on sort of these 2 options you see for small states, either geopolitical engagement, which doesn't work, or sort of engagement, and at the same time this idea of being a vassal hanging over it all. What's your view of this, maybe a third way of, we could call it regionalization, or in a way smaller nation states bundling together where they reach a sort of critical size to be either, what is that role then? Say like Nordic engagement together, or when small nation states and EUs decide to argue in favor of giving up, for example, the veto in EU foreign policy. What is that way, or you see a role for them?
Great, perfect. Everybody follow that lead. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm studying international affairs here. I'm a secondary student. I'm from Germany originally, but I'm curious about small states as well. I was wondering if you've considered the implications of this framework for climate change politics, because I was thinking quite a bit now about like small island nations arguing before international courts and so forth, where I think we see an interesting dynamic where their actual survival might be tied, might be threatened, and the great powers don't seem to be acting in time, for an atoll nation of any kind not to sink into the sea. And so what kind of options do small nations in situations like that have?
Thank you, Hannah. Perfect. And I think Ian's next, and then we'll have another round. So get ready if you've got questions.
Yeah, so I'm Ian. I'm an American, first-year student here, and so I guess my question concerns sort of the current events going on with the Trump administration. You're seeing some of the most overtly imperialist rhetoric that I think from a U.S. president in decades. Like yesterday, he said that we should own the Gaza Strip, for instance. And what I wanted to ask, like to this effect, if you think this will embolden Europe to also act more imperialistic in the future? Do you see the U.S. being more overtly colonialist, imperialist as enabling Europe to actually concentrate internal power, as you're saying, to project stronger external power?
Thank you. I'll take another 3 when those are done. But
Yeah.
Floor's yours, Pam.
Great questions. The first one, I lost your last words about the veto. What did you?
For example, Denmark has come out and said we should also get rid of the veto in EU foreign policy, even though according to your framework, that would be sort of falling under like France or German foreign policy in that sense.
Yeah. No, it's a very good one. And again, I'm not saying that small states do. There's nothing necessary that small states will be favoring the veto, for instance. they may be, small countries are often very happy to give away all their sovereignty. Sweden just did that with the DCA with the US, where we just said, you can do whatever you want. We will not ask a single question. You have all what you want. You can move in as many troops, and we give you 17 bases, and there is, you can't be prosecuted, you will not pay VAT, and so on and so on. So, I mean, small states are very good at that too, to simply become vassals, become pawns for the great powers. But I do think that, so my thought experiment when Britain, after Brexit, was to think, 2 more to go. The thought experiment of a European Union without Britain, France, and Germany, I think is a worthwhile thought experiment. Because I think, yeah, we don't think about that enough. And your question brings that up. What happens when small countries decide, to work together on that premise, that we're not doing this to kiss up to a great power. We're actually doing it to say that we will not play the great power game, and we will try to organize that voice more forcefully, but not to become geopolitical in that organization. And I think that is the non-aligned movement and so on. There are interesting parallels there to be had. But again, the EU countries, they behave very differently, and I don't see a pattern where there is any natural inclination that they would behave in the way I want them to behave. Rather, I see this history as instructive of the different ways they will behave, and then take it as the empirical examples. That answers your question about climate change. So you mean like that it's an urgency, that there is concerted action from the big players in the world, otherwise there will the consequences will be.
I mean, they are dependent on the big players acting, because those are often the main polluters, but the big players are not acting sufficiently quickly, at least for those very small island nations who are actually threatened right now.
Yeah.
So what do you do in that situation when you're that island?
Yeah, no, it's of course extremely difficult. Interestingly, some of the poorest countries in the world are doing a great deal, not only by just being poor and small, they do a lot for climate change, but they also take initiative. So Gabon, one of the poorest countries in the world, they saved their entire rainforest. Why did they do that? Well, one of the reasons is because they found it meaningful. And I think that's also important. And I'm not saying that, island nations that have, very difficult times. I'm not saying that it's in their hands, but I do think that small countries should do everything they can to mobilize their resources and to create meaning around doing things on their own, because it's a very dangerous situation when small countries are simply giving it up, like Sweden just did, saying, oh, our defense is up to the US to decide. What every position, we would just listen to you and follow your lead. I think that's not a good position. And I think it's really along those lines, I think. But again, you're absolutely right. If the big ones don't move, there will be horrendous consequences, and that's what we see. Trump, or the new administration, yes, I mean, there's some statements made now that are, yeah, it's hard to believe. On the other hand, I still haven't heard Trump Anthony Blinken's, when he said, the world doesn't organize itself, because that says a road. That's really saying world hegemony. And I think there's a difference there. But and what do I know? I think so much of this is a sideshow for things that are probably going on that we don't know. And then saying these outrageous things, that's just, part of that. But there is I've read some commentary saying, the Monroe Doctrine and that whole Western Hemisphere thinking, I could think there could be something there, but it's extremely, and I'm no better than anyone else to really know much how this will play out, but it's extremely turbulent, and the Greenland, the Panama Canal, I mean, it's extremely worrisome, and
Others? Gentleman with the beard at the back there? Which one? First, and then I can't see others, then there's somebody with a big scarf, and you can be number 2, and then over here on the left.
Hello, my name is Leo. I'm an American, studying international relations. Thank you for coming. It's very stimulating. I want to ask a question about the dichotomy between like geopolitical and non-geopolitical action. Is choosing, against vassalization or not to engage, is that decision by small states to not engage in these larger projects and not give up sovereignty to do that? Is that actually non-geopolitical? Is that actually a non-geopolitical action? Like if Sweden had decided to maintain its course of neutrality, because if they took on their reasoning and said it would be dangerous to do otherwise, is this actually non-geopolitical?
Person with a big scarf, I don't know his name. Oh, no, okay. There was here's Philip over here. What happens to small states? They get trampled on.
Right, so I'm Philip, I study European public policy. I'm an economist by background, so I'm not an AR expert, and I've not heard this type of argumentation to this extent before, but I'd like to be a little critical, if that's okay. The historical analysis, which you include a lot of quotes that oppose in a way self-determination and question the necessity and the reasoning behind that self-determination. Isn't that a bit of barking at the progress of history? At this point, ever since Napoleon, really ever since the French Revolution, the national self-determination in Europe, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russian Empire were inevitable. And they all cheered it. Everybody cheered the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, everybody cheered the collapse of the Soviet Union, everybody cheered the collapse of Yugoslavia, I mean, in the core, in the Western core. So what should have they said to Thomas Masaryk in 1918? What's the argument here? If we oppose this type of self-determination, or not oppose it, but we question it, that's one sort of question. The other one is, what's the lesson of this? Because this was very much so, in a way, inevitable ever since the nationalism became a major force in how states are built. And we are sort of looking at this without taking into consideration the realities on the ground. So what is the lesson of this for today, if we are saying that something happened 200 years ago or 100 years ago and the genie is out of the bottle? What's the lessons for today, really?
Okay. Just leave it there. Just answer those two. We can have another round.
Yeah. Sweden question, very good one. No, I mean, that would be an empirical question. Why would Sweden decide to go it alone? I mean, and then you have to look at the Swedish history of alliance, being not in an alliance for the purpose of being neutral in a great war. I mean, I did my military service during the Cold War, and I even taught recruits. I was teaching about the Soviet army. And I always asked my superiors, why are we only looking at the Soviet Union? I thought we were neutral, and so on. So you would have to do that, but the important thing is that Sweden's role in the world was not geopolitical. It didn't have a geopolitical foreign policy. What it decided was that it would have a defense that would work as a deterrent for foreign invasions. And so that defense became one of the most powerful in the world, which is hard to believe today. And then the change came, gradually after the end of the Cold War, and now we are here today where Sweden joined NATO. And the decision to join NATO is a decision to become a vassal in an official, formalized way. But prior to that, Sweden had played that role very, very much already, being sort of everything except for a NATO member. Prior to that, during the Cold War, the policy was very, very different. Yes, there were all these hedgings going on, but the purpose was never to participate in geopolitics like that. The purpose was to engage for all these non-geopolitical goals, disarmament being a big one, and also for living up to international law. I mean, those goals were very. Maybe you could argue that those are in some way geopolitical. Maybe. Just so I'm clear, you said opposition to self-determination, but I'm not. So you didn't misunderstand me. I mean, I'm not arguing. I'm not opposing self-determination.
No, I understand that you're not opposing it, but you're listing a lot of things that are critical about it. I mean, talking about it's a genie out of the bottle, that has a negative connotation on itself. We're talking about it negatively in a way. Or we're criticizing it at least.
Yeah, I'm criticizing the opposition. I mean, the attempt to keep the world a great power, imperial world order. I'm criticizing that world order, yes. But it wasn't inevitable. I mean, that's not how I read history. And we see that over and over again. And I think most importantly is that we're still stuck in this discussion. I'd like all these, I just showed the quotes from the Financial Times and so on, but also Timothy Garton Ash and thousands of other scholars are arguing that position, that self-determination implicitly or explicitly was a bad idea. Because the world doesn't organize itself. And it can be very, very complicated to organize it if there are too many different wills and interests around that have a claim and that have a say. And now we have international law. And I think that's the thing with sovereignty. When sovereignty was purely in the hands of the great powers, then it was fine. And that was also international law. That was how international law was set up, that the great powers, they had that on their side. The interesting thing is that once we have the UN and sovereignty is being claimed by the little guy, then the great powers start to argue against sovereignty, saying that now sovereignty is the bad guy. And that was Eurafrica. That's how they argued why African countries should not get national or independence. They should not become states because that was antiquated. Sovereignty, we have done away with that. It's a bad thing because interdependence is the rule of the game. So I'm saying at every instance, I mean, that's what I mean when we look at scholarship in the post-war period, we will see a lot of advocacy for the status quo world, that the world should be as it is. The British Empire was, for instance, Jan Smuts and many of those who formed the UN. That's a Mark Massower's work. Yeah. So I mean, and I see it today too, when strong voices today are advocating that the EU should just have a central sort of foreign policy, anything else is sort of crazy, like Gardnash and others argue. That we must sort of, that's where we have history to sort of see that's been, it has a historical background. So that's my sort of claim, that we are not, the 20th century is not over. We were very much in it because we think we resolve it, and the Cold War, end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union was of course the moment when we thought we had left the 20th century behind. But we're still at it, and Europe is very much caught up in the same solutions, doubling down on those solutions that failed in the past. So that's my position.
Okay, we have a question over here, the woman with the glasses. Any others? And here at the front. White shirt.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gilbert and Professor Hansen, for your speech and for your interesting vision of the things. I will try to squeeze my argument really briefly. So I would say, for the context, my name is Anna. I'm currently my MAR student here. I'm coming from Ukraine, and what I wanted to start with is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, most Eastern European countries joined the EU not because they were really fond of France or Germany. They joined because they wanted real reforms, because they knew what communist state is. And I believe the EU in this case became for us as a chance for formation. And for Ukraine today fighting for its independence, it's still backing with the US and with the EU because these countries, it actually helped us a lot. I can be really critical of of the weapons that they send and how slow it happens, but it changed a lot, and I see it growing up in a family that suffered a lot after the Russian influence, and seeing how even on the society level, everything changed thanks to the EU and to the Erasmus programs, to the way that EU professionals who have the long experience of institution building, of democracy, how they changed my country. And we're still in the process. And I would argue that it's not because we want to be a vassal to the US or to the EU, just because we know that this system works better and more effectively than the system that Russia has to offer. And I would say that in Africa, for example, today we have Russia that speculates on the colonial past by doing pretty much the same. They speculate against the West to take support of a lot of African countries, at the same time being the ones who are extracting resources from African states. So I would say that, don't you think that it's important to back up to those who are pro-rule of law, pro-institution building? Because when you're a small state in this big world, you will initially need to have cooperation with other states. Because it feels like today, a lot of these developed countries have choice between two worlds. The one which is, to put it in the frame, how you frame it, empire that will just extract resources, or the one that might not be ideal. I'm never saying that Western world is ideal, but it has a strong sense, I would say, of institution building that, for example, to my country helped a lot. So, I'm sorry if it was really long.
No, it's just perfect. And the person at the front here.
Hello, my name is Emma. I'm a second year student here. I was thinking about what do you think should be the place, or would be the future of the semi-independent nations, the sub-entities nation. I'm thinking Greenland, for example, or even the indigenous people who are seeking to get a seat at the table with other global powers, when the small nations recognized as nations, self-determined nations already struggling to find a place there? What is the space and for those sub-entities?
Good. To your question, I mean, I don't see the West historically, empirically as being better than Russia or if we separate out the EU from the US and China and so on. I mentioned the Iraq War. I think that's a very good example, and that those countries who participated in that illegal occupation and slaughter, they should, they should be punished, just like Russia should be punished for what it's doing in Ukraine today. And what I'm saying is that vassalship is not disinterested and without agency. You can be a very agent-like vassal, but what is always lurking in the background is this inequality, and that oftentimes backfire. That's why I took the example of Ukraine helping out with the occupation of Iraq, sacrificing for the US, but the US will not sacrifice for Ukraine in that sense. And the same, I mean, in Denmark's case, it's very similar. So I think those, I mean, I don't see that the Western way of doing foreign policy is any more benevolent. So I don't have that starting point. That's my, yeah. Your question about the states that are not formally independent nation states. Sorry.
Ask the question.
So you mean like you mentioned Greenland?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the sort of residuals of a world that was divided, and the modern world, we could say, the post-1945 development, when we got the world based on nation state, then there were several territories who did not receive statehood. I'm no expert in that area, but we see sort of consequences, and I think sometimes, I mean, it's very interesting with Denmark in that sense that people are learning a little bit about Greenland and the history there. That's very interesting. We know Palestine, of course, but we also know of all these remnants, these island groups spread out over the world, all over the world, that Britain, France, the Netherlands, and so on, they decided to hold on to them for geopolitical reasons often. Many times there are conflicts within these semi-countries of what to do, and yeah, it's look at Melilla and Ceuta in Morocco, which is geopolitical hotspots, and not least around migration. Maybe there could have been something in the EU membership for Spain. There could have been some leverage there, saying that maybe you should give up these enclaves, these colonial enclaves, and that would probably have solved a few problems. But again, yeah, they are very interesting. They're very often very small and very small populations, but they say a lot about the world and the system.
They're very much relics of empire, like colonial time, that we don't want to let go of, really, I feel like. And and it sort of fits in your analysis well, I think.
I mean, Mayotte, who voted a few years ago in a referendum to change their status from territory to département, yeah, you know all about it. And then they became integrated in the European Union fully. And of course, migration is the policy. That's how it is. But it is, yeah, it's very interesting and complicated.
Right, everybody, with this particular on the Thursday afternoon, we have to stick to the timetable. I'm just going to totally abuse my position as chair. I just make one or two final comments, and I'm very glad that we have such an interesting debate. And we can all agree or disagree with some of the points Bill's just been making. But I think there's some very interesting questions. And the first thing I'm going to do, just by way of summing stuff up, Bill mentioned in his talk the figure of E.H. Carr. E.H. Carr, somebody we do not study enough today. And as he rightly said, after World War II, and particularly in his book Nationalism After, Carr really said, my God, there are far too many nation states already. He's probably turning in his grave at the fact that there are more than 200 now. I mean, he would have been happy if there'd been 170 less than there are today. And he really wanted them to organize in what he called continent-style powers, which could produce, be efficient, and so forth. Now, he was contested against, and you must excuse me talking at length about this because I wrote my PhD thesis on it, so it's really quite nice to hear this. He was contested by none other than Leonard Woolf, the husband of James Riker. And Leonard Woolf basically said in a very famous argument, they had an argument. You know, small states matter. We've got to base our international system on what Philip was basically saying, the desire of countries for their nationality. And okay, it's going to be messy, but we have to respect small countries and their rights. And Mr. Carr, all you care about is efficiency and great big institutions. In other words, what we're doing here is having a debate about the morality of international relations and who gets to decide. No, this is the point. I think the lecturer tonight was very much saying you can't, small states do matter. You can't take away their agency, even if it's messy. Question mark, and I don't know how you would answer that. There. Now, the second thing I want to ask about, and the second point I want to make, and I hope Peter doesn't mind me bringing in a bit of personal history here. I actually first met him in Boston when he was expounding the Euro-Africa thesis to, let's put it diplomatically, a distinctly skeptical audience of EU studies experts, right? Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, very fair.
Fair. I thought there was going to be a sort of invasion of the stage at that point. Yet he was right, no, in the end. And I think most of us who study EU history will agree with him now. That map he showed mattered if you're studying EU history. And I think here, what I took away from this, something I took away from this, is a separate narrative, because the narrative of the EU, and perhaps even, you could argue, it's a truthful narrative, because narratives can be both truthful and false, is that the EU has been about dissolving sovereignty, about pooling sovereignty, about enabling small countries, and that's your point, to take part in a broader project, and hence, in a sense, enhance their status. Now, what we've just heard is an argument that says from the very first, the European integration project has had inherent in it a temptation towards empire. Or am I exaggerating? That's my second question.
On the first with Carr, you're the expert there, so I agree, and I think it's and as a lot of as many, I mean, great writers and so on, you don't have to agree with everything they say. Instead, that's just part of how stimulating it is to read them. But I think Carr is exceptionally interesting today for how he, I mean, not only politically, geopolitically, but also what he says about economics in the interwar period. I think that's incredibly close to the Eurozone crisis, to the hardship of many Eurozone member states, and how that has been articulated from the EU level. And I think also Carr is very interesting in the sense that, and I think it's almost inevitable that that's going to happen. If you argue against status quo, you very often, once you get your way, you end up defending status quo. I think I make that mistake myself, but I think it's very instructive to see that he became adamantly against a world that he saw breaking up into small parts. And he said that there could never again be more than 20 states in Europe. There could never again be more than 60 countries in the world. That was the max. But again, he was not alone. And I think that's been very much forgotten, the consensus, and that how many both politicians and academics who argued that it would be just messy if we did that.
I think he said somewhere they can't, if we had a world of more than 60 states, it wouldn't be possible to adequately administer it.
Yeah.
I think that's a direct quotation.
Yeah. The temptation to empire, yes, it's very tricky, and I think, yeah, it's a long answer to that. But again, I mean, the 1950s or the post-war period, all the initiatives for European integration was marked by its time. And that's so important. And that's why you should have the map and look at, especially France, but also Belgium, and look at, that's why if you compare the West Germany with, where I quoted Willy Brandt from the West German just 10 years previous, I mean, Konrad Adenauer was an adamant defender of empire. He did not acknowledge non-white people as fully human. He was defending that position, and he was not alone in that. And he said that there could not, I mean, that everything France did in Algeria or the Suez crisis, he was defending. It only took 10 years for that position to seem very, very strange, given how West Germany would develop in the 60s and especially in the 70s. So the beginnings are quite clear. It was an attempt to arrest that development, and they saw the African colonies of France and Belgium. That was the sort of the last stand of that. But it was also an image of a colonial renaissance, and it built on West Germany and France not accepting the Cold War. That's also in EU studies. We sort of start the EU studies by just taking the Cold War for granted. But West Germany and France did not. They accepted it in Europe, the irony, but they didn't accept it in Africa. In Africa, they didn't have to accept the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the US were not there. So they really felt this is the opportunity. And then, of course, it's a very different story. But if we look at policy, EU policy and policy statements, not least in the context of the geopolitical European Union, when they talk about the African Union, individual African states, it's quite clear that the EU has not fully accepted sovereignty in Africa. It's very, very clear. Remember when Angela Merkel, towards the end, she just said that, yeah, we need to think about places in the world where the US is not dominant. I think about Africa, and we need to be able to do military interventions there. That was just a statement. And that's become, with the geopolitical Europe, those statements have become more and more acceptable. So Ursula von der Leyen, when she said that it it doesn't make sense for the EU to build a road between a Chinese copper mine and a Chinese. And no, it doesn't make sense for the EU, but maybe it makes sense for an African country. But that's not what the EU, the EU doesn't accept that. And that's what I mean. Sovereignty is still a strange phenomenon when it comes to Africa. So that's where empire clearly lingers on. And also that when you compare statements to the 50s and to today, where the European Commission says that if we don't increase our efforts, our geopolitical efforts in Africa, someone else will do it. And that's again, where's the African agency here? I mean, one of the positive things happening in Africa is that there is more leverage on the African side, and that leverage the EU could live without. I mean, they didn't care about that because there was very little. When African states have leverage, it becomes immediately a problem for the EU. And that's why the articulation of the geopolitical EU towards Africa is very interesting to study, and where you get those connections.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We're all new and I'm like, mainly three breakfast, the rest of it should be. I was like,
Sometimes they turn this way. Authoritarian ideologies. It's always gonna be. This is the national.